Hey friends, today at Home Learning 3D we'll learn about the basic and the advanced settings that we can change and work on in NCloth. So let's begin. We have a small setup over here where you can see this can be called a bed. This could be a mattress. So let's start creating a bed sheet over here. So in the bed sheet right now, as you can see, I've cleared all the shape nodes and the transform nodes, so be careful to do that before starting with NCloth. So let's start now. I'll select the bed sheet. As you can see, when we start Maya, it's usually on, we usually work on polygons, but for NCloth we have to go to N Dynamics. Let's close all these. Then we'll go to N Mesh. So before going to create NCloth, we'll have to select the mesh that we are in mind to make the cloth. So after selecting the mesh, we'll go to N Mesh, we'll go to create NCloth. So since we don't have any solver in the scene, we'll select create new solver, apply, close. So now you can see there's a nucleus added to this cloth. So we'll go to attribute editor, and here you can see the NCloth shape, and these are all the settings of an NCloth. So one more thing that we have to take care with before starting for creating a cloth is that we have to have a very good number of mesh in the NCloth, so that it is good to, like, if the cloth is not having a high number of mesh, then it would not be a good and silky and basically more foldable type of cloth. So to make it a realistic looking cloth that could bend to a very large extent, we have to have a heavy mesh. So after that, we'll select all the other objects that we want the cloth to collide with and make them a passive collider. So for that, we'll go to NMesh, create passive collider. So once again the nucleus has been added. This will be the same nucleus, the one that was added to the NCloth. So this really matters because this cloth will interact with only those objects who have the same nucleus that are added to them, the cloth. So you can see this cloth is having nucleus 1, and even these objects are having nucleus 1. So right now I'm having a timeline of 1000 frames. So let's just check what we have here. I'll just play it, and before playing, make sure you go to preferences and change the playback speed to play every frame and max playback speed to real time. Let's play again. So now you can see the default cloth is very slippery, and if we don't do something, then it would not stick to the surface of the bed. So for that, we'll select the cloth, we'll go to NCloth shape, and first we'll see the collision properties. So in the collision properties, what we just majorly change, so first we'll see these two attributes. One is collide and one is self collide. Collide means the cloth mesh will collide to the objects, to any object. That would be made a passive collider. But the second option, that is self collide, this is a very good option provided by Maya, and this provides us the option that whether we want the cloth to interact with its surface or we don't want it to interact with its surface. So if we enable this, the cloth will interact with its surface and it will create a layer if it falls over itself. So that is very natural and realistic. But in some cases, if you don't want it to collide with itself, you can off the self collide option. Then second thing that we want to check is the solver display. So right now we majorly change only two things in the solver display. The first is collision thickness and the second is self collision thickness. So as I mentioned, there are two options. The ones we talked about earlier, first one was collide and the second one was self collide. So to show what are the boundaries, what are the major impact areas where the cloth will interact to each other, to itself or to the passive objects. So to see them and to modify them, we modify these options over here. So for the collision thickness defines how the cloth will interact with any passive object. And on the other hand, sorry, I don't know why it's not selecting. Go to outliner, we'll go to NCloth. So now for the collision thickness, we'll go to solver display and we'll check it to collision thickness. Now this is the thickness that defines how much the cloth will interact with the passive objects. So for instance, let me just change this thickness. So this solver display displays the value, and to modify the value we have to change this thickness. So let me increase it to a very high level. You can see this is very much heavy. So let's play the simulation again. So as you can see, it's already collided to the mattress, so it is creating a very heavy simulation. And other than that, you can see, just wait for few frames more. Okay, let me stop it here. Okay, so if I just off the solver display, you can see our cloth is almost like flying over the surface. So this thickness is acting very well. So let's take this thickness to its default value. That was this thing. So now let's work on self collision thickness. In this example, the self collision thickness won't create a major effect because the cloth is not interacting to its surface very much, so it's not a major point to see this thickness over here. So let's leave it for now. Then after that, you can see there are three settings: bounciness, friction and stickiness. This defines the properties of a cloth basically. So bounciness, as it sounds and as it is described, is that how the cloth will interact when it's interacted to the passive object in the sense of bounce. So if we want the cloth to bounce off the surface of the passive objects, we will increase it. If we don't, then it's not necessary. So the second one is the friction. So the friction is always between two different objects, but in this case the friction defines how much friction this cloth contains. So basically that means is when the cloth touches the surface of a collider or itself, how much friction does it produce. So more the friction, the lesser the cloth will move, the higher sticky the cloth will become. And stickiness, this stickiness is for just the cloth. So if we increase the stickiness, and when the cloth interacts with itself and its surface, it gets stuck to that very particular surface. So we don't want that. That's why by default Maya doesn't provide any stickiness to the cloth, but Maya provides just 0.1 friction to the cloth. So let's move to the dynamic properties of the cloth. So first property is stretch resistance. So this property defines how much stretching the cloth would produce. So this is basically if you want to create a rubber material, you can give it a less value, the stretch resistance. This is basically resisting the stretch of the cloth. So if the value is high, the cloth won't stretch, and that would give us a feel of plastic, or maybe a very hard type of thin object. So that's just it. Then there is compression resistance. Compression resistance is basically if we create a thick cloth and we want it to act like a heavy material, like a metal sheet or something, then it won't compress if you increase the compression resistance. These values basically are very easy to understand, as they provide those actions that are given in their name. So stretch resistance, the cloth won't stretch if you increase the resistance value of stretch resistance. Then compression won't appear if you increase the compression resistance. And if you increase the bend resistance, the bend resistance is a very useful value, because if you want to create a plastic sheet or a metal sheet that could bend just a little, then you can increase the bend resistance. But if you want to create a cloth, bend resistance is usually kept low, to a very low value. Then there is a value called rigidity. So increasing this value, you can basically get a very rigid object. So basically these all properties here define the dynamics of the cloth. So changing any of the few values, you can get same results that you can get by changing any of the other few values of the dynamic properties. So you need to just act basically on these three values: stretch resistance, compression resistance, and bend resistance, and a bit on these values: mass, lift, drag, tangential drag, damp, stretch, damp. So basically damping is create resistance. Basically it is also one type of resistance, but it decreases every value of the cloth. If the simulation is going very fast and you want it to get slow, you can increase the damp value, but it is not preferable to use damping. Then for understanding these values in a very good manner, you can either like play the simulation and try increasing and decreasing these values, or you can go to presets, check any of the preset you like, what your final output would be, what would the any preset that would be closer to your final output. So if you want to create a cloth, go for silk, replace the properties. So after just clicking on the replace button, you can see all the values of this cloth will be changed. So here you can see stretch resistance. So silk is not a stretchable cloth, so the stretching value has been increased, and you can see bend resistance has been decreased. So as you know, a silk cloth will bend to a very good level. So the bend resistance was from 0.070 is decreased to 0.050. So now you can see, I don't remember the default values of these ones, but you can check these values by just like doing this. But the major values, the advanced values that you have to check by your own are these, the solver displays. So you have to check whether the collision thickness is optimum, and whether the self collision thickness is also optimum. So now you can see, when I click on collision thickness, you see a plain sheet, but when I click on self collision thickness, you see spheres. So these spheres and these shapes can be changed from here. So collision flag defines the way the collision thickness will be defined, and self collision flag will define how the self collision thickness will be defined. So if I just uh, since collision flag is having faces, so if I just change this self collision flag to full surface, then we can see that it also shows the faces, but you can see this is very thick. Okay, if you see this off, our cloth is very thin and this is very thick. So for that, what you can do is we'll select this, we'll decrease this value a little bit, like till this much. So these values don't generally create problem, but if you are creating clothes for any moving object like a character or something, they sometimes tend to interact with each other and create some problems. So for that, you can choose to like modify these values, solver display, and majorly these values, solver displays and friction also. So after this, let's just test what we have created right now. Let me just switch off this value. You can see our cloth is creating very good wrinkles over here. So, and other thing is that you can see our cloth is still a very slippery cloth, not the much that it was in the first example, but it is still slippery. So to control that, now we'll move to the passive objects properties. So in this, you again have this collide option. So this will enable or disable whether the cloth should collide with the object. Collision flag, it also contains the thickness, solver display collision thickness. So it defines how much the boundary of this collision object is. So basically, if I increase this thickness like this much, then cloth will start interacting at this height that we don't want. So I'll press Ctrl Z. You can even decrease it a little bit, but you should take care of the fact that it should not go inside the object, because that would make your cloth penetrate the object. So we were talking about making the cloth stop on the surface, so we can increase the friction to a bit higher value, 0.5, and maybe we could give it a stickiness also like 0.4. So let us switch off the display and create a simulation. So now you can see the cloth is not slipping. So right now the stickiness is very high, so I'll decrease the stickiness. So now you can see we have a pretty good bed sheet over here, but you can see there are some edges on the cloth. So to improve that edges, we'll go to the polygons menu, mesh, and we'll give a division 1 level smooth to the cloth. So now you can see we have a very pretty good surface. Hope you learned something, and if you did, don't forget to subscribe for more videos.